Okay, so far we've talked about how World War One started, we looked at the causes of the war, talked about Maine. We also looked at propaganda, how different countries gained support for the war. We looked at how the war was fought. If you guys remember, we were doing the trench warfare simulation where you guys were throwing paper balls at each other. We talked about how kind of ridiculous this war was. Well, now today we're going to talk about how this war comes to an end and some of the things that came out of it that continue to affect the world even afterwards. So our topic of focus today is going to be the end of World War One. And the essential question that we're going to ask, because it's a very important question, is what makes compromise difficult? And compromise is one of those things that we all try to do with each other. It's one of those things we have to do as people, respecting each other's views and trying to come up with issues. But obviously, it's not easy to do in a lot of cases because we all think that we're right. So we're going to look at today during World War One how people tried to compromise and come up with solutions to each other. Okay, so towards the end of the war, the United States got involved. We talked about how the war started in 1914, but the U.S. tried to stay neutral throughout the war, and they did not get involved until two key events, the Zimmermann Telegram and the sinking of Lusitania, that really brought them into this conflict. But once they were in the conflict, the leadership in the United States tried to come up with a solution, and the solution that the president at the time, a guy named Woodrow Wilson, came up with was called the 14 points, and he outlined this plan for peace. And as you can probably imagine, there were 14 different points, but we're going to only focus on a few of them. Okay, to start off, he said that there were no secret treaties. Any kind of alliance system that had to be established had to be told to people. You could not simply say, me and you, our alliances, don't tell anyone else, because that's really what started World War One. He also called for freedom of the seas, basically that boats and ships could trade freely without having to worry about being sunk by submarines. He also called for the removal of economic barriers to try to get free trade and things like that. And we talked about how World War One started mostly because of alliances, but there was a buildup before that. And part of that was the buildup of weapons. And so Wilson called for a reduction of armaments or weapons. And because one of the other causes was imperialism, he also called for an adjustment of colonies. Now, the last point here, this key one down here that says establish a general association of nations, he thought it was important that we had in the world an association of nations, a group of nations coming together that was going to try for world peace. So really, the United States, towards the end of the war, tried to come up with this idea of how to keep peace in Europe. And we'll see how that worked out in just a second. Okay, now back to the war itself. We looked at the trench warfare and some of the brutal fighting that took place. And as we talked about in class today, we talked about how Russia was involved in all of this. They were one of the original countries that started. But as the war went on, their country really got demolished. They lost a lot of men. They continued to send a young generation of men to fight. And with that Russian Revolution we talked about, it drew Russia out of the war. It drew one of the big powers out of the war. And Germany, having been defeated pretty badly in several battles, especially since the Americans got there, tried to launch a last offensive against the Allied powers. Fortunately for the Allies, the Americans and the French were able to stop those advances. The Kaiser, when we talked about how Germany was formed, the Kaiser, the emperor, gave up the German throne in November of 1918. We call that abdication. He abdicated the throne. So the leader of Germany ended up leaving. Now, again, we don't ask you to remember many dates in this class, but one that we really need to remember, and one that's still celebrated every year, is called Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918. And for the purposes of this class, and really it's good to know that the war ended at a specific time, and they did this for a reason. And they called for the war to end on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It was kind of this symbolic thing. And so on November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock a.m., an armistice is signed. And when we have an armistice, what we're talking about basically is that both sides agree to stop fighting, that there's going to be quiet on the front. However, this doesn't happen right away. In fact, fighting still continues to go on, and some of those brutal fighting of the entire war takes place right before this armistice is signed. And the armistice is signed at 11 o'clock, and the last official casualty of World War I, take a guess on when it happened, 10:58 a.m. And actually a Canadian soldier was killed by a sniper at this time, and he's considered to be the last soldier that was killed during this conflict. So with that armistice signed on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, as you see here, World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, came to an end. The fighting came to an end. But there was still a lot of issues that needed to be resolved. Before they could figure this out, they really had to kind of regroup and figure out what the results of this war were and look at the body counts and casualties and things like that. And I want you guys to look at these numbers because I think that these numbers are just ridiculous, the amount of people involved here. Throughout the entire war, the Allies mobilized 42 million troops combined with all those different countries. And that's a really, really high number of troops. We talked about how, you know, certain countries even today have militaries don't even compare to what happened in World War I. The Central Powers mobilized 23 million troops. So you can see the Allies mobilized more troops than the Central Powers did. 8.5 to 10 million soldiers combined in the entire world died during World War I, which is a pretty ridiculous number. Another 21 million wounded. Now, military deaths, and we kind of broke this up by country, so we'll show you this here. Germany and Russia suffered the highest casualties, and if you remember that the fight we did in class at the very beginning of this unit, we told you that William and Ivan suffered the most, and that represents Germany and Russia. So almost 2 million people per country were killed. France and Austria-Hungary lost a ton of people. Great Britain lost 1 million. And then you see the United States here with only 110,000, but keep in mind that the United States came in 1917 and in 1 year lost this many men. So it just kind of gives you an idea of how brutal this war really was. And combined in Europe, an estimated $338 billion was spent on this war. You know, whether it was weapons or soldiers, ammunition, all that kind of stuff. And the aftermath of this is kind of ridiculous. You see these guys coming back without limbs, you know, whether it was trench foot or getting blown off by a piece of artillery. You see guys with deformities on their face. You see this guy up here in the corner. He probably got some kind of shrapnel in his face, or these machine gun bullets did a lot of damage to these guys. Because again, the machine gun was a new invention and they didn't realize, you know, kind of the effects that it had. But either way, you see the number of people involved and the amount of money that's spent. And so you can imagine that money is going to play a pretty big role coming up after World War I, because, you know, these countries are suffering now financially. Okay, but even after the armistice is signed, there still needs to be a way to get peace back in Europe. They've been fighting brutally for almost 4 years, and they got to figure out how to stop this from happening again. Very similar to what you guys tried to do with that whole peacekeeper scenario with that fight we talked about at the house party. And so the Allies, the victorious Allies, met at Versailles in January of 1919. And we call the leaders of this country, or of this conference, the Big Four: the United States, Britain, France, and Italy. Now it's interesting, we talked about Italy being part of the Central Powers at the beginning of the war, but during the war they decided to switch sides, and so at the end we have our 4 big victorious countries. Now if you notice, there's one country missing, and that country is Russia. And really that was because of their withdrawal from the war before it ended, with that Russian Revolution idea. So they were not invited to this conference, even though they lost almost 2 million men, as we saw a couple of slides ago. Now the problems they had to deal with. Again, not all nations were invited. We call it a world war because there were lots of nations involved, but not all of them were invited. And really these Big Four controlled the whole thing. The end of the war left a very confusing political situation in Europe as well. You know, a lot of issues with who's in charge of what country. We talked about how Germany, the leader of Germany, the Kaiser, left the throne, so he left that open. We have a new communist government in Russia. So it's just kind of confusing trying to figure out how all of this is going to fit together. The countries also had conflicting territorial demands. They wanted different areas, different territories. Now, the one that really angers a lot of people following World War I, specifically in Germany, were something called reparations. And when we talk about reparations, we're talking about giving money to people to pay them back for damages that have been caused. And in this case, the Allies blamed Germany for this whole war happening. And they said that they threw the first punch, they were the aggressors. But really, if you think about it, the loser of a fight typically gets blamed for it because they have no ground to stand on. They lost. So the victorious countries can kind of gang up on that losing country and make them responsible for it. And that's what the Allies did. And they wanted Germany to pay for all of the damages from that war. And along with that, at this conference, these big four countries considered something called a League of Nations. And we put that in quotation marks because that's what it was called at first, and that's what it became. But we're going to talk in just a minute about how this League of Nations became something different in the future. So this Paris Peace Conference was an attempt to try to regain this peace in Europe. Now, what kind of peace should there be? And this was a really big debate. Okay? And the U.S. wanted to be fair. They didn't want to be too harsh to Germany. And it kind of makes sense because if you think about it, the U.S. wasn't involved right at the beginning. And they're pretty far away from Germany. So there's not really a whole lot of fear in the U.S. at this time that Germany is going to do something bad in the future, at least to the United States because they're so far away. But the other allies wanted harsh punishment of Germany because since Germany was so close to them, they wanted to keep Germany from ever becoming powerful again. Okay, and France and Great Britain and Italy, they're nearby Germany, and so to them this is a much more important thing, and they really want to stop Germany from ever doing what they did before, building up that big military and doing what they did. So we wanted to think about these two sides and think about which of these peace plans do you think is the most valid. Okay, so is the United States plan of not punishing Germany, is that the right plan? Or should we punish them harshly? Because again, we don't want them to gain more power in the future. So take a minute and think about which of these plans you think would be the best. Okay, so come into class tomorrow. We're ready to discuss this. We're going to look at some of the specific things that the treaty that was signed following World War I did that really helped shape Europe and really the world for the next several years and directly led to our next conflict we're going to talk about, which is World War II. Okay, so if you need to review any of this information, you can always play it back again. Come into class tomorrow with questions that you want to ask. But after watching this, you hopefully get an idea of some of the issues that came up following World War I and some of the problems they had to deal with to create peace in Europe again.